I never thought I would have to explain to complete strangers that the field they were having a picnic on actually belonged to me. But the day a little girl looked up from her hot dog and asked if I worked for the vacation cabin, I realized my neighbor had quietly turned part of my farm into part of his business without ever asking for permission. Looking back now, the craziest part is that none of this started with anger or lawsuits or sheriff's deputies. It started with a conversation so casual that I almost forgot it happened. And if I had known where that conversation would lead, I probably would have walked away and written everything down that same afternoon. My name is Daniel Harper, and for almost 25 years I've lived outside the little town of Mill Ridge, Kentucky, on land my grandfather bought long before highways and rental apps changed the countryside. Around here, people don't usually need fences to know where they belong. They know because their parents knew, and their parents knew before them. The creek that winds behind my hay meadow has always been our natural boundary. On one side sits my barn, my equipment shed, and the field I cut every fall. On the other side, years ago, stood an old farmhouse that spent decades looking forgotten until a man named Eric Collins bought it. The first time I met Eric, I actually liked him. He was energetic, full of ideas, always talking about restoring old places instead of tearing them down. He shook my hand and said, "I think neighbors should help each other." I told him I agreed, because that's how I had always lived. If he needed a tractor to pull something out of the mud, I'd help. If I needed someone to keep an eye on my place while I was away, I figured he'd probably do the same. That's country life, or at least that's what I believed. For months, everything stayed peaceful. Construction crews came and went, fresh paint appeared, new windows went in, and eventually he told me he wasn't planning to live there at all. "It's going to be a vacation rental," he said with a smile. "People from a city want quiet weekends." I laughed and answered, "Well, they picked the right place." He chuckled and then, almost like he was mentioning tomorrow's weather, added, "Sometimes folks like to explore nature, so they might wander around a little." I looked at him and asked, "Around where?" He pointed toward the creek and shrugged. "You know, they'll probably walk over there." I didn't laugh that time. I said, "Eric, everything past that creek belongs to me. I don't mind looking at people, but I do mind strangers walking across my property." He waved his hand like I was worrying over nothing. "They're just families, nature lovers. They're not going to bother anybody." I remember answering, "Intentions don't matter much when someone is standing where they shouldn't be." He nodded, said he'd make sure guests understood, and that was the end of the conversation, or so I thought. The first visitors showed up in early spring. I spotted a couple walking through the meadow holding coffee cups and taking pictures of wildflowers. They smiled and waved at me as if I were another tourist attraction. I waved back because I assumed they had gotten lost. When I walked over and explained that they had crossed on a private property, they looked embarrassed and apologized immediately. The husband even pulled out his phone and showed me the rental listing, saying, "We thought this whole area was part of the experience." I remember thinking that sounded strange, but mistakes happen. They left without any argument, and I forgot about it. Then another family arrived 2 weeks later. Then a group of college kids. Then a retired couple carrying fishing poles. Every single time I walked over expecting an awkward confrontation, I found confused people instead of rude people. They all believed they were allowed to be there. Some even thanked me for sharing the land. It slowly dawned on me that they weren't inventing this idea. Somebody had given them the impression that the creek, the meadow, and the shade under my old sycamore trees were part of what they had paid for. I called Eric one evening and told him we needed to fix this before somebody got hurt. He laughed and said, "Danny, you're acting like they're invading your house." I replied, "No, I'm acting like someone keeps inviting strangers into my yard." There was a long silence before he answered, "People come out here to relax. Don't make this complicated." I looked across my porch toward the meadow where my grandfather used to stack hay bales, and for the first time, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel toward neighbor. It wasn't anger yet. It was disappointment, because I realized we weren't talking about the same thing anymore. To him, that open field was scenery that helped rent a cabin. To me, it was family history, years of work, and the place where every fence post had a story. I still believe common sense would solve everything, but sometimes common sense is the first thing that disappears when money starts showing up every weekend. The strange thing about living in the country is that trouble rarely arrives all at once. It sneaks in quietly until one morning you realize what you thought was an exception has become the new routine. That summer I stopped counting how many unfamiliar faces crossed my meadow because the number changed every weekend. Sometimes I would be repairing a fence and hear laughter behind me, only to turn around and see 3 people taking selfies beside my hay wagon like it belonged in some historical park. Other times I'd be feeding my horses when someone would yell across the field, "Excuse me, which trail goes to the creek?" The first few times I answered politely. After all, none of those people seemed rude. They were smiling, carrying coolers, wearing hiking boots, and treating the place exactly the way tourists treat somewhere they believe they have permission to enjoy. The problem wasn't them. The problem was that someone was making money by letting them believe a lie. My wife, Laura, noticed the change before I admitted it to myself. One evening while we were eating dinner, she looked out the kitchen window and said, "There's another family walking by the oak trees." I didn't even stand up anymore. I just sighed and said, "I'll deal with it after supper." She put down her fork and quietly asked, "How many times are you going to deal with the same thing?" That question stayed with me because I didn't have an answer. The next morning I drove over to Eric's place instead of calling. He was pressure washing the front porch while a landscaping crew planted flowers near the driveway. He smiled when he saw me, but the smile faded when he realized I wasn't there to chat. "We need to fix this," I said. "Your guests keep crossing onto my property." He leaned against the railing and shrugged. "I've told people to stay close to the cabin." "Then tell them again." "Danny, they're paying good money for a country experience." I looked at him and replied, "Then give them your country experience, not mine." He laughed a little, the kind of laugh people use when they think someone else is being unreasonable. "You're making a mountain out of a molehill." I answered, "No, you're making a business out of my land." His face changed for just a second before he looked away and said, "Nobody's getting hurt." That sentence bothered me all the way home because the truth was somebody could get hurt. My equipment stayed in those fields. I drove tractors through there. The creek rose fast after heavy rain, and there were hidden holes along the bank that locals knew to avoid. If someone twisted an ankle or worse, I had no idea what kind of legal mess could follow. A few days later, my friend Wade stopped by to borrow a chainsaw. He listened while I explained everything and then asked one simple question. "Did you put your concerns in writing?" I admitted I hadn't. He nodded slowly and said, "People forget conversations. They don't forget paperwork." I wish I had taken that advice years earlier. Instead, I still believed one more conversation would solve everything. The 4th of July weekend arrived with the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above a gravel road. I started cutting brush early that morning because I wanted to finish before noon. Around 11, I heard music. At first, I thought someone was driving by with the windows down, but the sound didn't fade. It got louder. I shut off the tractor and listened. Country music mixed with cheering and laughter floated across the meadow. When I drove toward the noise, I honestly thought there must be a community event I hadn't heard about. Then I reached the hill and saw them. 8 strangers had set up what looked like a full tailgate party right in the middle of my hayfield. Folding chair circlait à portable grille. A large cooler sat beside my fence post. Someone had hung a small American flag from one of my cedar trees. Kids chased each other through grass that would be harvested in a few months, and a Bluetooth speaker blasted music loud enough to scare every bird away. For a moment, I just sat there with my engine idling because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. Finally, I climbed down and walked over. A man holding a spatula smiled and said, "Beautiful place you've got here." I answered, "It is. That's why I'd appreciate it if everyone packed up and moved." His smile disappeared. "Why?" I pointed at the ground beneath his feet. "Because this is my property." They all looked at each other. One woman frowned and asked, "Wait, you own this?" Before I could answer, a teenage boy looked around and said, "I thought this belonged to the cabin." Then came a sentence I'll never forget. A little girl, maybe 9 years old, looked up at me with complete innocence and asked, "Do you work for the owners?" There wasn't a trace of sarcasm in her voice. She genuinely believed I was some employee walking through a resort. I felt my anger shift into something else. These people hadn't snuck onto my land. They had been led there by assumption, marketing, or carelessness. I took a deep breath and said, "No, ma'am. I'm the owner of this field, and whoever rented you that cabin should have explained where his property ends." The adults immediately started apologizing. One man pulled out his reservation confirmation and said, "It mentioned access to scenic creek areas." Another added, "We thought this was all part of it." I nodded and replied, "That's exactly the problem." They packed up without arguing, and before leaving, the father shook my hand and quietly said, "If we'd known, we never would have come over here." I believed him. That afternoon, I sat on my porch longer than usual. Laura brought me iced tea and asked, "So what happened?" I told her everything. She listened without interrupting and then said something my grandfather used to say whenever he saw a fence left unrepaired. "If you don't fix a boundary, eventually somebody else will move it for you." The next morning, instead of driving to Eric's house, I drove to the county sheriff's office. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I simply wanted an official record that I had warned my neighbor and that future trespassing would no longer be treated as an innocent misunderstanding. The deputy behind the counter listened carefully, asked a few questions, and slid a form across the desk. As I signed my name, he looked at me and said, "Sometimes paperwork solves problems that conversations never will." I walked back outside carrying a copy of the notice, not realizing that a single piece of paper would set off a chain of events neither Eric nor I could stop once it began. For about a week after I filed the notice, nothing happened, and I almost convinced myself that maybe the paperwork had done exactly what it was supposed to do. I drove past Eric's place a couple of times, expecting to see fresh boundary signs or a simple fence running along the creek, but there was nothing new except another SUV with out-of-state plates parked in the driveway. 10 days came and went. Then another morning, while checking a section of fence that a storm had knocked loose, I spotted 3 people wading across the shallow part of the creek carrying fishing rods and a cooler. They waved at me like old friends. I didn't wave back. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and called the sheriff's office. There was no anger in my voice anymore, just a calm that surprised even me. I gave the address, explained that a formal notice had already been filed, and waited. The 3 visitors walked farther onto the property until they noticed my truck parked near the meadow. One of them smiled and asked if the fishing was any good around there. I simply answered, "You'll probably want to wait a few minutes before deciding where to fish." About 15 minutes later, 2 deputies drove up the lane. The expressions on those visitors' faces changed from relaxed vacation smiles to complete confusion. The deputies were polite, professional, and patient. They asked where the visitors were staying, confirmed the rental address, and explained that they were standing on private property after an official trespass notice had already been issued. One of the guests immediately replied, "We thought this was included." I could almost recite those words with them by that point. The deputy looked over at me, then back at the group, and said, "Whether you were told that or not, you're currently trespassing." Citations were issued right there beside the creek. Nobody was arrested. Nobody argued. The guests apologized several times before leaving, but the damage had already been done, and for the first time the consequences landed exactly where they belonged. A few days later, I heard from another neighbor who occasionally cleaned vacation rentals around town. She called me laughing and said, "Have you looked at Eric's listing lately?" I hadn't. She told me several recent reviews mentioned an encounter with law enforcement and warned future guests to be careful because of confusing property boundaries. Apparently, the rental platform's automated system flagged the listing for a safety review after multiple comments referenced police involvement. Within days, active reservations were paused while the company requested documentation showing that guests could clearly identify the rental boundaries and avoid entering neighboring land. Suddenly, the problem that had never seemed important enough for Eric to fix became impossible for him to ignore. I didn't know exactly how much business he lost, but around town people talk, especially when money is involved. Someone at the local hardware store mentioned he had canceled nearly 2 weeks of bookings. Another person claimed the losses were several $1,000s. Whether the number was $4,000 or more didn't matter to me. What mattered was that every dollar could have been saved by putting up a few signs and telling guests the truth in the first place. About 3 weeks later, I came home from buying feed and noticed workers unloading fence posts along the creek. The following afternoon, bright boundary markers appeared. Then came fresh wire fencing in the areas where people usually crossed. Finally, large signs faced the rental property that simply read private property, no guest access beyond this point. I stood there reading those words and couldn't help smiling because that was exactly what I had asked for the very first time we talked. Late that evening, Eric pulled into my driveway. He climbed out of his truck looking far more tired than the confident businessman who had laughed at my concerns months earlier. We stood in silence for a moment before he said, "You could have handled this differently." I looked at him and answered, "I tried." He shook his head and replied, "You cost me a lot of money." I met his eyes and quietly said, "No, Eric. I asked you to protect your guests and respect my property. You decided not to. That's what cost you money." He didn't have an answer for that. After a few seconds, he simply nodded, got back into his truck, and drove away. That was the last real conversation we ever had. The funny thing is that my weekends became wonderfully boring after that. No more portable speakers echoing across the meadow. No more strangers asking if I worked there. No more children chasing each other through my hay field because someone online had blurred the line between private land and vacation scenery. The birds came back. The deer returned to the creek at dusk. In the fall, I cut hay with nothing watching except the wind moving across the grass, and somehow that silence felt more valuable than anything money could buy. Every now and then someone tells me I should have been more patient because the visitors meant no harm, and I always agree with them. They didn't mean any harm at all. But good intentions don't change property lines, and kindness doesn't require surrendering your rights. Looking back, I don't think this story is really about a fence or a creek or even a vacation rental. It's about what happens when one person quietly expands their convenience into someone else's responsibility and expects that neighbor to stay silent just to keep the peace. So now I want to ask you something. If your neighbor turned part of your property into part of their business without asking, would you have handled it differently? Or would you have done exactly what I did? Tell me in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious where you think the line should be drawn. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes good fences make good neighbors, but honest boundaries make even better ones.